Alright, this is going to be part one of shock. Introduction to shock. Shock is often unrecognized in early stages. Clinical signs and symptoms can vary. Clinical signs and symptoms can be very subtle. Many different presentations can occur. Shock is not a primary diagnosis. Physiological adaptation to an insult is what actually shock is, and the body is attempting to preserve vital functions. Shock results from changes in the circulatory volume, cardiac function, peripheral vascular resistance. So again, if you've looked at the other ones, heart rate, contractile force strength, and peripheral vascular resistance. Shock can cause changes in organ systems, cardiovascular, respiratory, renal, gastrointestinal, classified into stages. We have compensatory shock, which allows us to compensate for the demands put upon us. Progressive shock. Then we have decompensating shock, somewhere in between these two. And then irreversible shock. At some point, no matter how much medicine we sling at them, they are not going to come back from the demands that was put upon them. They're too far out. Shock defined. Local or systemic hypoperfusion resulting in the inability to meet cellular demands. This can affect tissue, organs, and organ systems. Can result from an insult to the heart, lungs, blood vessels, the blood itself, or the nervous system. Compensatory mechanisms. They counter-effect the shock state. Inability to correct an insult may actually lead to death. Cellular physiology. This is an overall or an overview of glycolysis. And then all glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose. How we store glucose is as a polysaccharide in the liver in the form of glycogen. When glycogen is broken down and glucose is broken down, we use some energy to do this, and that's those areas here in the form of ATP. But we also get back some ATP as well. We net gain 2 ATP molecules, and this is all about power. Well, that says ATP, huh? ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. We net 2 ATPs from glycolysis. Now, what this does, whenever we break it down, these phosphate groups here, NADH and FADH, that we'll see in the Krebs cycle, are high energy groups. From those high energy groups, those are actually going to something called the electron transfer chain, or the mitochondria. And what the mitochondria does with, or the electron transfer chain, is it produces a lot more ATP molecules very efficiently from those molecules that we produce from the breakdown of glucose. So we immediately change, noting from the last slide, we're breaking down glucose to the form of pyruvic acid. Whenever we bring the pyruvic acid, and this is in the mitochondria, into the Krebs cycle, we immediately form, through coenzyme A, NADH, and this is one of our high energy molecules. As we start going through the Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle, we make more NADH, which all of this is very important. By the time that we continue through this, we get another product called FADH2 and another NADH. Now, in this process, we also put out an ATP molecule. But these things here, these compounds, these high energy compounds, all going into the electron transfer chain, is what produces us the most ATP. Now, from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, if we didn't have oxygen, and everyone needs to make high note to this, that without oxygen, the electron transfer chain does not function. With just the Krebs cycle, or this process here, and the process of glycolysis, we will produce 4 ATP molecules. The electron transport chain produces 32 ATP molecules. So, quick review here. If we're wanting to produce energy, what do we have to have working? And the answer is the electron transport chain. What does the electron transport chain need to work? And that answer is very simple: oxygen. Pathophysiology. Peripheral tissues, they cannot store oxygen, has to rely on a constant perfusion or delivery of oxygen and the removal of metabolic waste. So these things are continuously moving oxygen and CO2 back and forth to the periphery and then removing wastes that are off of there in the return. Oxygen uptake, or VO2, or oxygen consumption, is the amount of oxygen taken up by the mitochondria in the body. The amount of oxygen, or the amount of oxygen consumed. Metabolic requirements for oxygen, or the MRO2, is the rate at which oxygen is metabolized to water in the mitochondria. And this also gives us, water is a byproduct of the Krebs cycle. This also gives us, this is a process in the electron transport system that we're talking about here. So the metabolic requirements for oxygen, all coming out of the ETS, is going to give us 32 ATP molecules. But as we identify this, we're going to use this in a formula here in just a second. So this is the rate in which oxygen is metabolized to water in the mitochondria. All right. So the VO2, or the oxygen consumption, must match or exceed the MRO2 for aerobic respiration to occur. And this is aerobic with oxygen. So the VO2 must be equal to or greater than the MRO2 for normal metabolism to take place. And this is aerobic respiration. We're going to get 36 ATP molecules and be able to supply energy to the system. When the VO2 falls below the MRO2, anaerobic metabolism occurs. Oxygen uptake fails to meet the metabolic demands for oxygen. So VO2 is less than MRO2, anaerobic metabolism will ensue. Anaerobic respiration results in the production of 2 molecules of ATP. Pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid. We cannot have pyruvic acid in large quantities. Our body's going to try to get it out of the intercellular environment and change it to lactic acid, which is kind of problematic because that's going to adjust our overall acid-base arrangement. Okay, so very simply, let's Barney this down just a little more. So for an aerobic respiration or aerobic metabolism to occur, we have to have ample oxygen supply, and that's my little mitochondria, to the mitochondria. So for aerobic with oxygen metabolism to occur, we have to have oxygen in high enough quantities to where it's like a surplus to the mitochondria. In anaerobic metabolism, and this means without oxygen, we're only going to make 2 ATP molecules. So essentially, if we cannot get oxygen or have enough supply to get oxygen to our mitochondria, then very simply, we're going to go into cellular bankruptcy. Dysoxia. Situation in which the production of ATP is limited by the supply of oxygen, and this would be an anaerobic state of metabolism. Oxygen is said to exist when shock is said to exist when dysoxia causes a measurable change in organ function. Under normal conditions, oxygen delivery will never be a limiting factor for cellular metabolism. Very quickly, I want you to see this under normal conditions. The oxygen consumption max will be exceeded before the oxygen supply becomes a limiting factor. VO2 is a function, very simply, of your cardiac output. How well does your heart work? The available amount of hemoglobin, how much blood do you actually have in the system? Or the difference in oxygen saturation between the arterial venous blood, or SaO2 minus the SVO2. How much is actually going to the end cells and how much return blood in the residual or my residual supply do I actually have, is what this is. The cell in shock. Oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin, 1.34 milliliters per gram of hemoglobin. A normal VO2, or oxygen consumption carrying capacity, is going to be 100 to 160 milliliters per minute per meter squared. Now this is going to be moving through a solution, so we have quite a bit of oxygen carrying capacity in the actual blood supply and in the actual vessels. Precursors to shock, very simply. Inadequate cardiac output. So if the pump fails, definitely we're going to get into a shock state. Inadequate hemoglobin concentrations or oxygen carrying capacity. If we don't have enough hemoglobin to carry the oxygenated blood, then we're going to get into a problem. Inadequate arterial oxygen saturation. So for whatever the reason, we can't get it to the capillary level down in the distal tissues. Sodium potassium pump. Most energy produced by the cells drives the sodium potassium pump, and this maintains ionic gradients across the cell membranes. I'm going to draw a little cell here really quick. Intercellular environments. In here, the sodium is 10 milliequivalents per liter, and the potassium is 140 milliequivalents per liter. So you have a high concentration of potassium in the cell, and not so much sodium. So you do have a little bit of sodium, but it's a low amount. Extracellular environment. Out here, the sodium level is 140 milliequivalents per liter, and the potassium is 4 milliequivalents per liter. Now what that does is that causes a gradient. So very simply, if I opened up the ports on this cell, where do I have a higher concentration of sodium at? Well, outside. So sodium is going to want to do this. Very simply, where's my potassium at versus outside? I have a higher concentration of potassium than I do on the outside. So from a greater of higher concentration to a greater of lower concentration is the movement that I'm going to get from these. What a sodium potassium pump does is it throws that ion against its gradient. And by doing that, it changes the polarity. This is the way that we power our action potentials in our body. And this is a picture of it right here. Very simply, sodium potassium shift to change the polarity on the outside of the cell so that electricity or an action potential can travel down it. Sodium potassium pump dysfunction. Lack of ATP, or the lack of energy, produces production in an anaerobic metabolism, and remember we're only making 2 in an anaerobic without oxygen state, results in a failure of the sodium potassium pump. Sodium moves to the intercellular environment. You also get, if sodium moves in here, guess where the water is going to follow? Same way. You get swelling, lysis of the cells. Clinically significant organ damage can occur in this. This is what would happen. Let's say if I move sodium in here, water follows it until we burst the cell. When cell lysis involves many cells, organ function is compromised. Shock develops, especially if it's an organ that is in the perfusion part. Overall effects termed compensatory mechanisms, which is an increased heart rate, increased contractility, increased peripheral vascular resistance. So heart rate, contractile force, peripheral vascular resistance. Fluid in the middle. Renal retention of salt and water to maintain plasma volume, and the assembling of metabolic fuels. We start at homeostasis, which is here. Homeostasis is disturbed from physical stress, chemical changes, or increased tissue activity. Inadequate local pressure and blood flow causes an autoregulation. Neural mechanisms. we're essentially going to kick off stimulation that would affect systemic blood pressure, activation of cardiac centers, short-term elevation of blood pressure, and this is done through the sympathetic nervous system, sympathetic stimulation, and hopefully this will restore homeostasis. If that doesn't work, the endocrine system comes into play and gives us some long-term effects. Stimulation of the endocrine response, long-term blood volume and blood pressure. Hopefully this right here is going to restore homeostasis. So sympathetic nervous system is going to be short-term, endocrine system is going to be long-term. Neurohumoral responses and shock. Compensatory mechanisms can only be tolerated for a short period due to myocardial stress. You can't run everyone off of jet fuel forever. Decreased blood flow to non-vital organs, ischemia, you're going to shunt towards the core. And then lactic acid production and accumulation or metabolic acidosis. Whenever the cells go anaerobic, the pyruvic acid that's in the cell gets stored or gets moved out in the form of lactic acid. This changes the overall pH of the system. Signs and symptoms of shock. Skin, cool, clammy, diaphoretic. Neurological, restless, anxiety, lethargy, confusion. Cardiovascular, we can get tachycardia, thready pulse, low cardiac output, low blood pressure. Respiratory, rapid breathing and then shallow respirations. As far as metabolism goes, low temperature, thirst, acidosis, or low urine output. At the point that ADH gets involved, antidiuretic hormone or anti-peeing hormone, this is what gives us a low urinary output. If we get hypotension, the afferent artery to the kidney with the adrenal gland on top doesn't get the appropriate amount of blood supply because the blood that was once going there is shunted towards the core to save the overall organism. Neurohumoral agents and effects. Hormonal and nervous factors influencing the blood pressure. So adrenaline gland, and this is on top of the kidney. We got several factors here that we're going to talk about. We have ADH. We have adrenaline hormones, which we get three of them. We get epinephrine and norepinephrine, and then we also get something called aldosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid. So let's kind of start it here at the adrenaline gland. So adrenaline gland realizes that you're hypoxic and that the blood pressure is going down. So it dumps short-term responses, which is epi and norepi, to try to increase cardiac output and squeeze down on the vessels so the homeostasis can be restored. It also releases in the same action a mineralocorticoid, which affects minerals and affects the intake of sodium, which is aldosterone. Whenever aldosterone comes into the kidney, it works in the distal convoluted tubule. The juxtagulomedullary apparatus in the kidney releases renin, which will work on angiotensinogen and convert it to angiotensin 1. In the lungs, you have ACE, which will convert it to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is a massive vasoconstrictor. So that's just from the kidney's perspective. Hopefully, the aldosterone sodium intake and the movement of water towards the core, along with the sympathetic hormone, will create homeostasis. However, the posterior pituitary also releases antidiuretic hormone, which just so happens to also work in the distal convoluted tubule. All of these areas in conjunction either give a short-term or long-term response to stress or shock, low blood pressure. Norepinephrine, it's a vasoconstrictor, and we do get a little bit of increase in myocardial contractility with this. This up here is an adrenergic receptor and how it works. We get an upfront release of acetylcholine, which causes this receptor to fire. This is an adrenergic postganglionic neuron, which that's how we identify what type of receptor site we're dealing with. In the case of norepinephrine, or in the case of the adrenergic postneuron, it will release norepinephrine in the post-ganglionic area towards the target tissue. In the case of the adrenergic or the parasympathetic, or the, cholinergic or the parasympathetic neuron, up front is by acetylcholine, and then acetylcholine is released at the post site. Whereas in the adrenergic, acetylcholine is released in the pre-site, and norepinephrine is released in the post site. Norepinephrine itself will cause a massive alpha-1 response, and will give us a little bit of beta, but not near as much as it will the alpha-1, which is vasoconstriction. Epinephrine. Epinephrine gives us alpha and betas. Alpha-1, alpha-2, beta-1, beta-2. Beta-1 and beta-2 are muscle. Alpha-1 and alpha-2 are primarily vascular. The alpha-1, alpha-2 is going to cause a vasoconstriction. The beta-1 and beta-2 is going to increase the heart rate, contractile force strength. The beta-2 is going to open up the bronchial tubes because of their smooth muscle surroundings in the bronchioles. Angiotensin II. You have angiotensinogen in the plasma. The kidney releases renin, which turns it into angiotensin 1. In the lungs, you have something called angiotensin converting enzyme in the capillary alveolar membrane. Whenever it sees angiotensin 1, ACE converts it into angiotensin 2, which causes a direct vasoconstriction and an increase in blood pressure. Antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone comes from the posterior pituitary. ADH then works on the kidney, which in the glomerulus, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. In the distal convoluted tubule, antidiuretic hormone sends the stimulus to please conserve water. So water comes back in and urine is more concentrated. Anti-peeing hormone. Aldosterone. They have it right here. My apologies, I was fixing to draw an adrenaline gland on top of the kidney. A mineralocorticoid from the adrenaline gland is aldosterone. Aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption, water follows sodium, and blood pressure is increased. Cortisol. Cortisol suppresses the immune system. It is a glucocorticoid, also produced by the adrenaline gland. Promotes protein catabolism and increases blood glucose. This is an end to part 1. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, roy.smith@redlandscc.edu or smithr@imsa.net. Thank you.